In this episode, we will take a look at the 6502 timing diagrams and take the mystique out of them. They seem to contain a lot of rules that you need to adhere to, but we will pick this apart and show that it's not that hard actually. The timing diagram may look complicated, especially when combined with a rather large table with lots of figures in it. The reason this looks complicated is not because it is complicated, but rather it shows many different scenarios on top of each other. Some other datasheets display the different scenarios in different diagrams, and I think that approach is much easier to read. To not be overwhelmed by the infinite space of possibilities, we need to define some key parameters. The most important parameter is the clock frequency, and for the Alt6502, the design frequency is 2 MHz. That frequency defines the boundaries of the timing diagram, which in this case will be 0 to 500 nanoseconds. The clock signal defines the pace of the system, so let's add that to the diagram. The most important clock on the 6502 is called phi2, and hence the double notation on the left side. Note that I've not drawn the clock as an ideal square wave. There is a slope on the flanks which represent an analog property of the signal, that is, it actually takes time to transition between the two logical levels. This is in fact our first requirement of the timing diagram. The rise and fall times of the clock should be less than 5 nanoseconds. This is actually a surprisingly tough requirement, and to maintain such sharp flanks, the bus signal path must be capable of much higher frequency components than the ground frequency of 2 MHz. I guess that this is necessary for the chip designers to keep the promises given in the datasheet. In my practical experience, however, the 6502 can live with a much more relaxed slope time when running under hobbyist conditions like room temperature and limited reliability requirements. Speaking about flanks, the usual time reference for a flank is the midpoint between the high voltage and the low voltage. This explains why the datasheet states that the low and high portions of the clock should be a full 250 nanoseconds. That is, they don't take away the rise and fall times of the flanks. Let's take a look at the first CPU scenario, the read cycle. It is very simple. The CPU indicates a read operation by driving the read-write signal high. First, the CPU provides the address to memory, and then it expects data back a little while later. The CPU decides what to do on the negative clock flank. It starts to generate the address, and it will take at maximum 150 nanoseconds for it to stabilize. Hence, we can expect that the value of the address cannot be trusted until 150 nanoseconds after the negative flank. In fact, the read-write signal also stabilizes during this time period. After this time, we can trust that the address is stable and can be used for memory addressing. It will remain stable until the next negative clock flank, and in fact the CPU promises to hold the address stable for at least another 10 nanoseconds after that, and this is to give some margin at the negative clock flank so nothing funny happens if the address should start to get invalid at the end of the clock cycle. The reason why we don't want anything funny to happen at the end of the clock cycle is because it is at this point that the data is actually read by the CPU. The CPU puts a requirement that the data must be valid sometime before and sometime after the negative clock flank to guarantee that it is read properly. It is required that the data is valid at least 60 nanoseconds before the clock flank and 10 nanoseconds after. The 10 nanoseconds after coincides with the extra 10 nanoseconds address valid time, and this is not a coincidence. It would be hard for the memory to guarantee that the data would be valid if the address wasn't valid. Since the data must be stable at time equal to 440 nanoseconds, but there isn't a valid address until time equals 150 nanoseconds, we have a timing window of 290 nanoseconds between those 2 points. Within this window, the memory must be able to read the address, look up the value and provide it to the CPU, and make sure it has stabilized. This is called the memory access time, and for a 65CO2 running at 2 MHz, the required memory access time must not exceed 290 nanoseconds. In the Alt6502 design, the memories have an access time of 50 nanoseconds, so there is a pretty high design margin here. Let's have a look at the write cycle. It differs from the read cycle in the sense that the read-write signal is 0, and the data goes from the CPU to memory rather than vice versa. Even though the address time is exactly the same, there is a key difference when it comes to the validity of the address and data. When the CPU performs a read, it doesn't matter so much if we perform a read from the wrong address position initially, as long as the right address is valid for a sufficient amount of time at the end. The CPU register will finally obtain the right value. But when we do a write operation, the consequences of an invalid address is much worse. We can potentially write to an incorrect memory address, or even write to several addresses. Therefore, we absolutely need to make sure that the address is correct before we issue a write operation. This is solved by using the positive clock flag as a reference point. Effectively, the CPU promises that the address will be valid while the clock is high. It is actually valid 100 nanoseconds before that, but it is nice to have a robust signal telling us when we can trust the address. What the CPU will do is to publish the data that it wants to be written to the memory at the time of the reference point, but it doesn't guarantee that it will be stable until at maximum 140 nanoseconds later. This leaves us with a timing window of at least 110 nanoseconds for the memory to take in the data, or actually it is 120 nanoseconds since the CPU promises the extra nanoseconds just as in the read cycle. This timing window needs to be checked against the corresponding parameter for the chosen memory. In the Alt6502 memories, this figure is 35 nanoseconds, so it's a pretty good margin here too. So, how do we construct a write-enabled signal that takes into account these signals? There is a pretty easy solution. The read-write signal is inverted, so it becomes a 1 when a write operation is requested. When this write signal is 1 and the clock is high, we should generate the write-enabled signal. There is an AND device here instead of an AND one, because typically the write-enabled signal is active low on most memories. The timing diagram of the write sequence will now look like this, but the signal delays of the gates are not displayed. We can see that the address is valid during the entire write-enabled period, but we may put invalid data into memory in the beginning before it has stabilized. In the end, however, there is enough time for the data to stabilize so that we can guarantee that the right data is stored at the right memory location. So let's go back to the original timing diagram. It is not so daunting anymore. These are the requirements of the clock flags and the clock duration, and these are the 10 nanoseconds extra margin I mentioned, and this is the address stabilization phase, and this is the memory access time, and these are the data is stable periods. I have ignored a few other signals. For instance, there is an overflow signal which I don't use, whose validity is related to the positive clock flag, and there are a few interrupt and reset signals that this diagram relates to the negative clock flag. And finally, there is a BE signal which makes it possible to turn on or off the bus of the CPU, and when turning it on, it takes 30 nanoseconds for the data to be valid. So it's not all that complicated. That's all for this episode. Next time we'll take a look at the construction of the main board and the backplane board, do some simulated mechanical integration testing between paper printed PCBs and 3D printed items before sending them off to production. See you next time!